They thought he was just another confused old man losing his mind. The way he stared at empty corners, muttering names no one recognized. The way he'd suddenly snapped to attention when a car backfired outside. The nurses at Sunset Manor rolled their eyes when Henry Kowalski, 89, would insist that Charlie Company needs backup, or demand to know why his rifle wasn't cleaned for morning inspection. But on the night 3 armed men broke into the nursing home, expecting easy targets and quick cash, they discovered that some warriors never truly retire. What they found instead was a Korean War veteran whose mind might wander through decades, but whose instincts remained razor-sharp when innocent lives hung in the balance. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. on a cold Tuesday in November. Most of the 43 residents were asleep, vulnerable and defenseless. The night staff consisted of just 2 nurses and 1 security guard, who spent more time scrolling his phone than watching monitors. It should have been simple. It should have been quiet. It should have been easy. Henry sat in his wheelchair by the window of his room, as he did most nights when sleep wouldn't come. His weathered hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white from arthritis that reminded him daily of carrying wounded soldiers through Korean winters. To anyone watching, he looked like what he was supposed to be, a frail old man whose body had betrayed him, whose mind drifted between past and present like smoke. The first sign of trouble was the main door alarm going silent too quickly. Henry's head turned toward the sound, his cloudy blue eyes suddenly sharp with focus. In the hallway, Nurse Janet assumed the security guard had stepped outside for a cigarette again. She didn't see the 3 figures dressed in black moving through the lobby with practiced precision. Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez led the group, a career criminal whose rap sheet included armed robbery and assault. At 35, he was muscle-bound and mean, chosen for jobs that required intimidation. Behind him, Tommy Wire handled electronics and security systems, his slight frame hiding quick hands and quicker thinking. The third man, Danny "Scar" Williams, was the wild card, unstable, violent, and prone to enjoying his work too much. They'd chosen Sunset Manor after weeks of surveillance. Elderly residents meant minimal resistance. Night staff meant fewer witnesses. The facility's outdated security system meant easy access. What they hadn't counted on was the man in room 237 whose hearing, despite his age, could still distinguish between a security guard's footsteps and the sound of men moving with tactical awareness. Henry's transformation began gradually. His posture straightened imperceptibly. His breathing shifted from shallow and irregular to deep and controlled. The vacant stare that nurses attributed to dementia focused with laser intensity on the sounds filtering through his door. He was no longer Henry Kowalski, confused nursing home resident. He was Sergeant Henry Kowalski, Charlie Company, 2nd Infantry Division, Korean War. Tank pushed through the first-floor common area, his silenced pistol drawn but casual. These weren't enemy combatants. They were sheep waiting for slaughter. Wire quickly disabled the remaining cameras, while Scar headed toward the medication storage, already anticipating the high-value prescription drugs they could fence within hours. In the nurse's station, Janet looked up from her crossword puzzle as the lights flickered. She frowned, reaching for the phone to call maintenance, when Tank's massive frame filled the doorway. The gun in his hand made her freeze, her mouth opening in a silent scream that never came. "Don't make a sound," Tank whispered, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man comfortable with violence. "Where's the medicine cabinet? Where do you keep the good stuff?" Janet's hands trembled as she pointed toward the secure pharmacy area. Tank zip-tied her hands behind her back with efficient movements, then shoved her into a supply closet. This was supposed to be simple. Get in, grab the drugs, maybe rough up anyone who saw too much, then disappear before police response teams could mobilize. But Henry had already mobilized. Moving with surprising stealth for a man supposedly confined to a wheelchair, he transferred himself to the floor. His legs might have been weakened by age and injury, but his arms retained enough strength to propel him forward in a combat crawl that muscle memory had preserved for 70 years. He moved through his room's darkness, gathering improvised weapons with the systematic thinking of a soldier preparing for contact with the enemy. The lamp became a club. The metal bedpan became a shield and striking weapon. Most importantly, his Korean War combat knife, hidden beneath his mattress for decades despite nursing home policies, found its way back into his hand. The weight felt familiar, comfortable, like greeting an old friend who understood the language of survival. From his position near his doorway, Henry could hear Tank moving through the facility, could track the intruders' positions by sound alone. Wire was in the main office, probably dealing with security systems and looking for cash. Scar's footsteps were erratic, undisciplined, moving toward the east wing, where the most vulnerable residents slept. Tank was methodically searching the medical storage areas. They were spread out, overconfident, treating this like a simple robbery instead of a tactical operation. That would be their mistake. Henry began his counterattack with the patience of a hunter who had learned, in frozen Korean mountains, that rushing meant dying. He waited until Tank moved past his room, then emerged into the hallway like a ghost from another war. His combat crawl carried him soundlessly across linoleum floors that had witnessed decades of shuffling feet and wheelchair wheels. Wire was hunched over a computer terminal, trying to access financial records, when Henry struck. The old soldier's approach was absolutely silent, a skill that had kept him alive when Chinese forces outnumbered his unit 50-1. The combat knife slid between Wire's ribs with surgical precision, finding the lung without touching major arteries. Wire collapsed, not dead but definitely out of the fight, his breath coming in short gasps that wouldn't allow him to cry out for help. 1 down, 2 to go. Tank was in the medication room, stuffing bottles of OxyContin and morphine into a duffel bag, when he heard a sound that didn't belong. Not the shuffle of elderly feet or the squeak of a wheelchair. Something else. Something that made his criminal instincts flash warning signals. Wire. You good? He called softly. Silence. Tank's hand tightened on his pistol as he moved back toward the office area. He found Wire unconscious on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, but alive. Professional work, not random violence. Someone who knew exactly where to strike to incapacitate, without immediately killing. What the hell? Tank muttered, his confidence evaporating as he realized this wasn't going according to plan. From the shadows near the nurse's station, Henry watched Tank's reaction with grim satisfaction. The criminal was scared now, off balance, making mistakes. Henry had seen that same expression on enemy faces in Korea, the moment when predators realized they'd become prey. Scar's voice echoed from the east wing, crude and excited. Hey Tank, you gotta see this. Some of these old biddies got jewelry and cash just lying around. Henry's blood ran cold. Scar was in the residential area, near people who couldn't defend themselves. Margaret Chin in room 201, who'd lost her husband in Vietnam and spent her days knitting scarves for homeless veterans. Robert Martinez in 203, a fellow Korean War vet who'd never talked about what he'd seen at Chosin Reservoir. Dorothy Williams in 205, whose son visited every Sunday with her great-grandchildren. They were Henry's responsibility now. His unit. His mission. Tank was moving toward Scar's voice, trying to regroup, when Henry struck again. This time, there was no subtlety, no surgical precision. Tank was dangerous, armed, and heading toward innocent civilians. Henry came out of the shadows like a fury from the past, the bedpan catching Tank in the knee with enough force to shatter bone. Tank went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. But he was tough, a street fighter who'd survived worse. He rolled, trying to grab the pistol, when Henry's combat knife found his gun hand, pinning it to the linoleum with a wet thud. Tank's scream echoed through the facility, a sound of pain and rage and disbelief that a crippled old man had put him down. Impossible, Tank gasped, staring at Henry's face in the dim emergency lighting. You're just some old man. You can't even walk. Henry's voice, when it came, carried the authority of someone who'd given orders under fire and watched good men die following them. Son, I walked through hell when you were nothing but a bad idea in your daddy's head. You picked the wrong nursing home tonight. But there was still Scar to deal with, and Henry could hear him moving through the residential wing with increasing agitation. The sound of drawers being yanked open, furniture being overturned, and worst of all, the frightened whimpers of elderly residents who'd been woken by the violence. Henry left Tank zip-tied with his own restraints, the criminal's gun unloaded and hidden. The knife stayed with Henry as he began his final assault, crawling through hallways he'd navigated in a wheelchair for 3 years, now moving through them like the combat veteran he'd never stopped being. Scar was in Margaret Chen's room, demanding she tell him where she kept her real money. When Henry appeared in the doorway, the scene, a violent criminal terrorizing a helpless 87-year-old woman, triggered something primal in the old soldier's mind. This wasn't just robbery anymore. This was what he'd spent a lifetime fighting against. "Step away from her," Henry said quietly. Scar spun around, taking in the impossible sight of an elderly man on the floor, covered in blood that wasn't his own, holding a combat knife like he knew how to use it. "What the hell are you supposed to be, Grandpa? Some kind of action hero?" Scar laughed, but there was hysteria in it now. Tank's screaming had stopped, and Wire wasn't answering his radio. This was all going wrong. Henry began moving forward, using his arms to propel himself across the floor with steady, relentless purpose. "I'm someone who's seen enough evil for one lifetime, and you're done here." Scar pulled his own gun, a cheap .38 that shook in his hands. "I'll shoot you, old man. I swear I will." "You can try," Henry replied, never stopping his advance. "But I've been shot before, by better men than you, in colder places than this, and I'm still here." The psychology of fear is a weapon Henry had learned to wield decades ago. Scar was watching an elderly nursing home resident crawl toward him, armed with nothing but a knife and absolute determination, and somehow that was more terrifying than facing down gang members with automatic weapons. When Scar's nerve broke and he fired, the shot went wide, punching through drywall instead of flesh. Henry moved faster than should have been possible for someone his age, rolling behind Margaret's dresser as 2 more shots followed the first. "Margaret," Henry called softly. "Stay down, sweetheart. This'll be over soon." Henry's counterattack came from an angle Scar wasn't expecting. While the criminal was focused on the dresser, Henry had used furniture and shadows to reposition himself near the room's closet. The combat knife flew with the accuracy of decades of practice, catching Scar in the shoulder and spinning him around. The gun clattered to the floor as Scar stumbled backward, clutching his wounded shoulder and staring at Henry with newfound terror. "Please," Scar whimpered. "Don't kill me. I got kids." Henry looked at him with the cold assessment of someone who'd been forced to make life-and-death decisions when he was barely old enough to vote. "So did the men I killed in Korea. So did the friends I couldn't save. The difference is, they were fighting for something that mattered." But instead of finishing Scar, Henry zip-tied him with restraints taken from Tank, then helped Margaret back to her bed with gentle hands that minutes before had wielded lethal force. "Are you hurt, dear?" he asked, his voice returning to the kindly tone she knew. Margaret stared at him with wide eyes, seeing him clearly, for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived at Sunset Manor 3 years ago. "Henry? What? Who are you?" Henry smiled sadly as sirens began wailing in the distance. Someone had finally called the police. Just an old soldier, Margaret. Just someone who couldn't forget how to protect the people who matter. When the police arrived, they found a scene that defied explanation. 3 armed criminals subdued by a man who supposedly couldn't walk unassisted. Nurse Janet, freed from the supply closet, kept insisting that Mr. Kowalski, from room 237, had somehow single-handedly stopped the attack. The lead detective, a veteran herself, looked at Henry, back in his wheelchair now, looking every bit the confused nursing home resident, with professional skepticism. "Mr. Kowalski, the other residents say you stopped these men, but according to your medical records, you have severe mobility issues and early-stage dementia. Can you explain what happened here tonight?" Henry looked at her with eyes that held decades of secrets. "Sometimes, officer, we remember what we need to remember, when it matters most." As the criminals were loaded into ambulances and police cars, the other residents of Sunset Manor gathered around Henry with newfound respect and understanding. They'd seen him as a confused old man lost in memories of a war most of them barely remembered. Now they understood that those memories hadn't been confusion at all. They'd been preparation. The facility director, arriving at dawn to survey the damage, shook her head in amazement. "Mr. Kowalski, I don't understand how you were able to do what you did tonight. The doctor said your condition was degenerative, that your mobility was severely limited. Henry wheeled himself toward the window where he'd spent so many sleepless nights, watching for threats that everyone assumed existed only in his deteriorating mind. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the body might forget how to work, but the heart never forgets how to protect the people you love. And everyone in this place, they're my people now. My unit. That makes them worth fighting for, no matter what it costs." As the sun rose over Sunset Manor, Henry Kowalski returned to his room and his chair by the window. To anyone watching, he was just an elderly veteran, confused and frail, staring at empty corners and muttering names no one recognized. But now they knew those names belonged to friends he'd lost in Korea, men who'd taught him that some fights never end. They just change battlefields. And sometimes, when innocent people need protecting, an old soldier's war continues in ways no one expects. The attacks stopped that night. The criminals went to prison, and Henry went back to his routine of sitting by his window, watching over his people, ready for whatever might come next. Because some duties transcend age, disability, and time itself. If this story touched you, and you found something meaningful in it, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to support more stories like this.